Throughout the years, we've seen a lot of Batman animated movies, over 40 in fact. And while some of them are great, there are some that stand out as being more memorable or unique when compared to others. One of my favorite concepts for a Batman animated movie is when they make a crossover with another franchise. It's something that we've seen twice, and both times the movies turned out to be great, with the crossover aspect being a huge part as to why they were so good. First, we got a crossover with ScoobyDoo in 2018, which also served as a revival of Batman the Brave and the Bold. And given that the same writers and producers from that show returned to work on this movie, it ended up being really good, much like most episodes of The Brave and the Bold. It focused on Scooby-Doo and the Mystery Gang being invited to join the Mystery Analysts of Gotham City, comprised of Batman, The Question, Plastic Man, Black Canary, Detective Chimp, and Aquaman, who wasn't really a member but he still tagged along for the story. The movie brings back most fan-favorite characters from the show, and while Scooby and the gang feel like the more predominant characters, it still strikes a nice balance by using the traditional Scooby-Doo story format of investigating the identity of a masked monster and a traditional action-packed episode of The Brave and the Bold. They played with the usual tropes of both franchises and had very fun interactions between the characters.
Are those Chocos?
Yes?
Mine.
This movie served as a great revival of The Brave and the Bold, and a celebration of the relationship between Batman and Scooby-Doo. This wasn't even the last time that Scooby crossed over with the DCU, since they later released yet another crossover movie with Crypto the Superdog. It's also really nice how Batman and Scooby-Doo have a history together that goes all the way back to the 70s, and they had already met during a previous episode of The Brave and the Bold, where Batman met other non-DC characters such as Sherlock Holmes, Space Ghost, Daniel Day-Lewis, Obama. A year after this in 2019, we got another great crossover movie in Batman vs. the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And man, I love this movie. I honestly believe this is one of the best animated movies that DC has ever made. It had a very entertaining yet simple main plot. The characterizations of every character from both franchises felt on point and stayed very true to how they traditionally act in most incarnations, allowing for really fun interactions. And it has some of the best fight scenes and choreographies of any DC animated movie. I mean, the fights between Batman and Shredder were just sick. The action in the movie was just fantastic. They even got to show multiple on-screen deaths. It could get really brutal at some points. The TMNT and Batman mythos seem to complement each other really well. Shredder already feels like he belongs in Batman's Rogues Gallery. And this movie, much like the Scooby-Doo crossover, combined the usual tropes of both franchises to make the story even more interesting. Stuff like how they had Gotham's villains mutating into animals is a very traditional TMNT plotline but applied in a Batman context. The main theme of Batman opening up more, allowing himself to depend on others, and learning the value of family was also a really nicely done character arc that thematically tied the movie together. And I just love the attention to detail that makes it clear this movie came from a place of love and fan adoration. All the little Easter eggs are amazing, like Batman drinking coffee from a Superman mug, Bane having a teddy bear in his Arkham cell, the Turtles calendar referencing April O'Neil, or the original red suit early design by Bob Kane being displayed in the Batcave. All of this makes the movie feel even more like a love letter to all these characters. Another really cool thing is that the movie ended with a post-credit scene that teased a sequel, with a Jokerized Shredder laughing maniacally, something that would be really awesome, and it does have a precedent given that there's already a sequel to the comic it's based on. I'd love to see a Batman vs TMNT too, but I'd also love to see even more animated crossovers between Batman and other characters. And if we take a look at the comics, there's already a ton of crossover ideas that could potentially serve for some really awesome animated movies. One crossover movie I'd love to see is Batman vs. Spawn.
What the hell are you? Spawn.
Some of you might already know that back during the 90s, Spawn had an amazing animated show that aired on HBO. And it was actually one of the earliest examples of a Western adult animated series that mostly focused on action and more serious, serialized storytelling, something that's very common nowadays but wasn't as common back then. So while Batman was elevating the standards of traditional Western animation for all ages, Spawn was pushing boundaries in adult animation, and both of these are some of the best shows from the 90s in my opinion. It shouldn't really surprise us that Spawn received an entire animated show so shortly after he had been created, since the character was immensely popular at one point. So much so that he even got not one, but two comic book crossovers with Batman back in 1994. The first one, for example, was written by Frank Miller and illustrated by Todd McFarlane, with a very generic plot where Batman and Spawn were manipulated into fighting against each other by an original villain named Margaret Love that was created just for the story and never appeared again because she was just boring. Both heroes were written in a pretty out of character way. And the stupidest thing is that Batman won every fight against Spawn, something that just shouldn't happen. No matter how much prep time Batman has, Spawn will simply always win in most scenarios against him. Years later though, in 2022, there was another crossover written by Todd McFarlane and illustrated by Greg Capullo, which was a lot better. The art is amazing, the story is simple but interesting, and even though Batman and Spawn still get manipulated into fighting, at least Spawn ended up winning this time. It also has the Court of Owls and the Joker, back when he still used his face as a mask. And there's this gruesome scene in the comic where he even takes off his face. It even had a teaser that implied Joker might have been working with the Violator. None of these comics really have material for a full hour-and-a-half animated movie, but the idea itself of a team-up between these two heroes and their worlds is definitely strong enough that it could easily sustain an entire movie. People would love to see Batman and Spawn teaming up to fight against Joker and the Violator. They could have each hero visiting one another's worlds, like having Batman get trapped in hell for a portion of the story, and leaving Spawn as the protector of Gotham for a while, until they reunite later in the story to fight against the villains. There's a lot of possibilities with a team-up like this. I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to see a Batman vs Spawn movie, and I really think it's about time that Spawn finally returns to animation. Hell, imagine if they could get Keith David back to voice Spawn for a special crossover movie. That'd be just insane. Another indie comic anti-hero that's been laying dormant for a while, who could theoretically get revived for a Batman crossover movie, is Judge Dredd. The last time we've seen Judge Dredd get a big push behind him was in 2012, when British movie studio DNA Films produced a live-action Dredd movie starring Karl Urban, which sadly underperformed at the box office despite it being a really great sci-fi action film. It's honestly one of the most underrated comic book movies ever made, and you should seriously check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Despite the financial failure of the 2012 film, everyone involved still tried to make some kind of continuation for it. Karl Urban has repeatedly stated that he'd love to play the role again, and around 2017 there was an announcement of a possible live-action TV series titled Judge Dredd Mega City 1, which would have seen Karl Urban return as Dredd, but production on this series was halted due to the 2020 pandemic. No further news have been reported after this, and as of right now, the last time we've seen Dredd get adapted outside the comics was for an animated miniseries titled Judge Dredd Super Fiend, which is actually fully available on YouTube, and was produced by Adi Shankar, an executive producer of the 2012 Dredd movie.
Do not be afraid. Dying is good. Dying is easy. I just stick my hand in.
Now, could you imagine if we saw Judge Dredd return once again in animation, but this time in a crossover movie against Batman? I know that Dredd isn't really as popular as Spawn, but he is a somewhat recognizable character whose stories and world can be pretty compatible with Batman. And we've actually seen the two characters cross over in the comics before. In 1991, they met during a story titled Judgment on Gotham, where Judge Death gets transported to Gotham City and starts killing people until he's defeated by Batman. At which point, Batman gets transported to Mega City 1, where Judge Dredd actually tries to arrest Batman for being a vigilante. resulting in them fighting each other, with this comic being so well received that Batman and Dredd got 3 other crossovers afterwards. Speaking of indie comic characters who were once popular but are now laying dormant, I bet a lot of you still remember The Mask, one of the most iconic comedy movies of the 90s that was really successful at the time, but that couldn't maintain its relevancy as a franchise throughout the years. Still though, did you know that The Mask actually had a crossover comic with the Joker? It's a story where the Joker and his crew rob a museum filled with ancient artifacts, including the titular mask. And the story takes a turn when one of the Joker's henchmen puts on the mask and gets transformed by it, with Joker being amazed by his powers and convincing the masks to work together as partners. The Joker, of course, later betrays his henchmen and steals the mask for himself, becoming incredibly dangerous with his powers, in a way that kind of reminds me of the time he got 5th dimensional powers during Emperor Joker. It's just really fun to see storylines where he gets a power-up. This comic could serve as a basis for a really fun crossover movie, and The Mask has proven to work in animation before with his old animated series. The guy is basically a living cartoon character in a normal world. Now, Batman isn't the only DC character that has crossed over with other franchises. A few years ago, DC released a 2-part animated movie crossover with Ruby, which is an animated web series that has become pretty popular online. So we know that DC is willing to make crossover movies even without relying on Batman's name. And one of the coolest characters that the Justice League could possibly meet is Godzilla. And King Kong too. And what's cool about this is that very recently, DC actually published a comic where they met these iconic kaiju. It's a story that had the Legion of Doom being transported to Skull Island after a fight with the Justice League in the Fortress of Solitude. And there, Toyman makes a wish with a powerful magical item called the Dreamstone that sent the monsters from Skull Island to the DCU. And the story is filled with amazing moments that are begging to be adapted, like Gorilla Grodd worshipping King Kong as a god, Godzilla fighting against Superman in Metropolis, or Kong even becoming a Green Lantern. Seriously, this comic is awesome, and I think that a crossover between DC and the Monsterverse is something that most fans would very much enjoy. One crossover that I wish could have turned out better was when DC met Mortal Kombat back in 2008. It was actually the last mainline Mortal Kombat title before NetherRealm rebooted the franchise. Something that wasn't too surprising at the time, since Mortal Kombat vs DC unfortunately wasn't as good as it could have been. But even though the game wasn't a big success, it still cemented the association between these two franchises, and we might have not seen the Injustice games without this one first. Personally though, I always liked the idea of DC crossing over with Mortal Kombat, and have always wanted to see the concept explored further, and it seems I'm not alone on that one, since Jeremy Adams, the screenwriter for the Mortal Kombat animated movies, has actually said in the past that he pitched to Warner Brothers the idea of making a crossover animated movie between both franchises, but they rejected the idea. I'd love for them to reconsider this though, since the combined brand recognition of MK and DC could result in a really popular movie if they create a good story out of the concept. Another Warner Brothers property that the company owns, but hasn't been treating it with the respect it deserves, is Looney Tunes. And it's a shame how they've neglected what are arguably the company's most recognizable mascots. I know that the Looney Tunes haven't been as popular as they've been in past decades, but we need to acknowledge that part of the reason why they declined in popularity is because of the lack of faith Warner Brothers Discovery has in the franchise. Between canceling a Looney Tunes musical, shelving Coyote vs. Acme, and erasing the classic cartoon catalog from Max, it seems like Looney Tunes has been mostly abandoned by its own rights holders. And as someone who grew up loving these characters and their cartoons, it's something that honestly really hurts, since it's a clear sign of how times are increasingly complicating within the animation industry. And I just hope things can get better moving forward. Still though, chances might be low, but a guy can still dream. And something that I'd love to see is a full-scale animated crossover movie between DC and Looney Tunes. Something that has happened many times before, and it could potentially help in boosting the Tunes' popularity just a little bit. A few years back, DC actually published a series of one-shot comic book crossovers teaming up different DC and Looney Tunes characters, and most of them were pretty great. And what I'd love to see is for DC to use these one-shots and adapt them for an anthology movie, similar to their DC Showcase collection of shorts. A movie where we could see many different stories with the Justice League members and the Looney Tunes meeting each other and causing shenanigans. For example, the most famous one-shot was a story with Batman and Elmer Fudd that showed Elmer as a hitman going to kill Bugs Bunny in a bar owned by Porky, and it's all framed as a classic detective noir story that tries to play the whole thing somewhat realistically while also being very self-aware and humorous about it. In some one-shots such as this one, the Looney Tunes were reimagined as human beings in the DCU, and other times they simply drew the Looney Tunes as realistic-looking animals. Like in a story with Catwoman meeting Sylvester and Tweety, written by Gail Simone, that was about some witches making a bargain where each would choose a cat and a bird, and whichever animal died first, it would cause for all other animals of that same species, and also all beings who are themed after those animals to also die. This serves as an elaborate setup to have Tweety Bird team up with Black Canary, and Catwoman teaming up with Sylvester, with them later fighting each other to the point it escalates so much that every single cat-themed and bird-themed hero and villain from the DC universe all start fighting each other. It's really ridiculous and awesome. And these line of one-shots really had a myriad of interesting ideas, like a comic about Daffy Duck becoming a henchman for the Joker, or a western story where Jonah Hex meets Yosemite Sam. They could easily grab the most interesting comics and adapt it into a really entertaining animated anthology. You know, instead of just letting the Looney Tunes die. Please, Warner Bros. Discovery, don't let the Looney Tunes die. For the love of God. Of course, these were all just a short list of examples of the many different amazing crossovers that DC could make if they wanted to. I know that rights issues are always complicated and the profits of a crossover production have to be shared between the two different companies, but it's also a good way of expanding your audience and getting new fans from other fan bases. There really are a ton of other crossover ideas that I could have mentioned. Like imagine an animated movie with the Justice League and Sonic. Because that's actually going on in the comics right now, and I haven't read it yet, but it looks sick, and I'm willing to bet that it would also be pretty sick in animation. But hey, I want to know, what other franchise would you like to see crossover with DC in a full animated movie? Please share your ideas in the comments, and as always, thank you so much for watching.